It's good to be with you again. We look forward to coming each summer, and especially being from Alabama, we look forward to coming up north where we can get cool. That's been a complete bust this time, but we've been able to spend time with family, and I'm glad to be able to be with you this evening. There's this one time that Peter, the apostle, was arrested. You can read about this in Acts chapter 12. He was arrested by this fella named Herod. Now Luke in Acts calls him Herod. And if you have read much of the New Testament and paid attention, you remember that there are various people called Herod. This Herod in Acts chapter 12, he's not the most famous Herod. The most famous Herod is the Herod at the time of Jesus' birth, and we could call him Herod the baby killer, right? The guy that had all the little babies in Bethlehem killed, that Herod. Now, he didn't call himself Herod the baby killer. That guy called himself Herod the Great. He was the first of the Herods. He had a bunch of wives and a bunch of kids. And, Herod the baby killer is not a bad nickname because he had some of his own kids killed, including this fella that we're reading about in Acts chapter 12. This is Herod Agrippa. His father was this guy named Aristobulus, who was the son of Herod the Great. Herod the Great had him killed. This guy in Acts chapter 12 is the grandson of Herod the Great. All right, we got the family tree now. So, this guy, Herod Agrippa. Now, there are actually two Herod Agrippas in the New Testament. A little bit later, Paul is going to run into, in the later chapters in Acts, he'll run into another fella named Agrippa, Herod Agrippa. That would be Herod Agrippa II, this guy's son. So this is Herod Agrippa I that we're looking at in Acts chapter 12. He had Peter arrested because he thought it would be a good idea to win some PR points. He knew that there were a lot of people in Jerusalem that did not like the Christians, that did not like the followers of the way, and that Peter was one of the leaders, and so he had him arrested. Now, he had this happened in about the year 44 AD, and it was just after Passover. It was actually during the days of unleavened bread. And so the plan for Herod Agrippa was that he was going to save up Peter through the feast of unleavened bread, and then after that feast, he was going to bring him out and have him executed. Well, it didn't turn out that way. In the middle of the night, before Peter was going to be executed, an angel showed up in Peter's cell, said, "Get up," to Peter. The chains fell off. The angel told him, "Grab your staff, put your coat on, get your sandals, get your belt on. Come follow me." Peter got up out of the cell. He thought he was seeing a vision. He didn't realize that what was happening was actually happening. He followed the angel out. They went past 4 sets of guards. Luke tells us that there were 4 sets of guards. 4 sets of 4, 16 guards guarding Peter. They went past them. They were asleep. I don't know if the angel had put some sort of hex on them or not, but they were sleeping through it, and the angel led them out of the prison, led them into the city. The city gate opened by itself. They went through the gate, went into the city. The angel at that point disappeared. And that's the point that Peter sort of came to his senses and realized that what he had been seeing actually had happened, and he was now a free man. He went to the house where he knew Christians would be gathered. This was Mary's house, a certain Mary. She was the mother of John Mark. I guess he was at the gate. He sort of maybe called out or something. "I'm here, it's me." There was a servant girl named Rhoda who heard Peter. Apparently she did not open the door and get a look at him, but she just heard his voice. She went She didn't even let him in. She went and ran and told everybody, Peter is here. He's outside the door. Of course, nobody believed her. You're crazy. You're out of your mind, Rhoda. She said, no, it was him. I heard his voice. They said, no, it can't be that. Maybe it's his angel, they said. Now, I don't know what they meant by that. What were they thinking? It's his angel. Did they mean it's his guardian angel? Did they mean maybe he's already been killed and his spirit has come to report some story like Obi-Wan Kenobi or something like that? I don't know what they meant. It's his angel, they said. Finally, she went and let him in, and Peter was there, and everybody's hipping and hooraying at the wonderful thing that has happened. And Peter says, quiet down, and he tells them about the angel and all that had happened. He says to them, now I want you to report this to James and the brothers. And then he goes away. Now, the reason we know that this happened in 44 AD or thereabouts, maybe a little bit before that, but the reason we know to associate it with that year specifically is because of what happens next. Herod Agrippa, after the days of unleavened bread, he wants to bring out his prisoner so that he can win his PR points by having him executed. And he goes and tells people to get Peter, and lo and behold, there's no prisoner there. Well, then he goes up to Tyre and Sidon. He's been having a dispute with Tyre and Sidon, and there's a delegation there at Tyre and Sidon that are wanting to talk with Herod Agrippa. And so he has some meetings with them, and then he makes a speech. And you remember maybe what the people of Tyre and Sidon say to Herod Agrippa after that speech. They say, the voice of a God and not of a man. And lo and behold, an angel shows up again. Just like in Peter's cell, this time an angel comes to strike down Herod Agrippa I. And Luke says he was eaten by worms and died. Now, I'm betting if you have ever read this story before, you remember that phrase, that he was eaten by worms and then he died. And I've always thought, well, that's sort of strange, isn't it? Shouldn't it be reversed? He died, and that we'd call people like worm food when they're in the ground. But of course, sometimes it goes in that order. People get worms. I have read other stories that I will spare you, but I can share you the details if you want. Not right now, but later on. They're sort of nasty. But there are these other stories about people getting eaten by worms, and usually there's a stench that goes along with it. And then they die. So apparently that's what happened to Herod Agrippa I, eaten by worms and died. Josephus tells us about the death of Herod Agrippa, and it happened in 44 AD. So that's how we know to relate this whole story to 44 AD, to that specific date. It's an amazing story of liberation, of freedom. The church had gathered together and prayed for Peter, and God made a miracle happen, and Peter got released. It's Peter saved from certain death. Now, this is not the first time Peter has seen somebody saved from death by God. He experiences it in Acts chapter 12, but he's seen it before. He was there in Jairus' house when Jesus came and said to that little girl, Jairus' daughter, this is Mark chapter 5. Jesus said to her, Talitha cum. Little girl, I say to you, get up. And this girl that everybody knew had died, the mourners were there already. They were weeping and crying over this 12-year-old girl that had just died. You remember Jesus said she's not dead, she's just asleep, and they all laughed at him. And he went in and he raised her up and said, give her something to eat. And he restored to life, saved from death this little girl. That's not the only time that happened either. Peter has seen it happen several times in the life of Jesus. At Jairus' house, you remember who was there? It was Jesus, and it was Peter. You remember who was with him? It was James, and it was John. It wasn't all 12 of the disciples. The 12 disciples were not invited into that room, only Peter and James and John. And there are several times in the Gospels that those three were sort of, whatever you would say, singled out. Seems like the wrong way of saying it, but, tripled out. When these three were selected for special treatment there at Jairus' house. Of course, on the Mount of Transfiguration also, that's Peter, James, and John. They alone were invited up the mountain to see Jesus glowing there with Moses and Elijah in Gethsemane. It was Peter, and it was James, and it was John that Jesus said, wait with me here and pray. And he went off and prayed his prayer to the Father, let this cup pass from me. He prayed, yet not as I will, but as you will. Peter, James, and John often are selected for special treatment in the Gospels. On the one hand, you have Peter, the rock, and on the other hand, you have James and John, the sons of thunder. The sons of thunder, James and John, they sometimes make other appearances in the Gospels as well. You remember that in Luke chapter 9, they were going through this village of Samaria, and the village of Samaria did not welcome Jesus, and James and John got so put out by that, they said, Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy this village? Of course, Jesus said, no, I don't want you to do that. Thanks anyway, don't. James and John are they're sort of impetuous, they're sort of impulsive. Peter is too. And maybe that's how they got their nickname, Boanerges, the sons of thunder. There's this other time that they went and asked Jesus, just flat out asked him for special treatment. This is Mark chapter 10, verses 35 to 40. And yes, I know that Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 to 28 gives the parallel account, and there it's the mother of James and John that asks for this, but in Mark chapter 10, it's James and John themselves. I don't know if they both asked individually or what, but I can certainly imagine a mother going to Jesus and saying, you need to treat my boys in a special way. But maybe it was James and John, maybe it was both, I don't know exactly, but in Mark chapter 10, James and John go to Jesus and they say to Jesus, remember the question? In your kingdom, I want to sit on your right hand, my brother on your left. We want the best seats. Seems sort of bold, doesn't it? Audacious to ask Jesus this. Do you remember what Jesus responded? Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? You remember they said, oh yeah. The cup? Sure, we can do that. The baptism? Oh yeah, we got that. No problem. What was the cup that Jesus was referring to? Suffering, right? Death. I don't know if they knew that. Yeah, we can do that. We just want the best seats. Jesus said, you will drink the cup that I drink. but to sit on my right and on my left, that's not mine to give. It is for those for whom it has been prepared. James and John are impetuous, impulsive. Acts chapter 12 does not start with Peter being put in prison. Acts chapter 12 starts with James being put in prison. Luke tells us it's James, the brother of John. So we know that it's this son of thunder. It's one of the big three apostles. It's one of the premier apostles, the special in-circle, in-crowd group that Jesus often selected for special missions. This special band of three that were being prepared for something. It was that James. And there was no angel that came to rescue him. He met the sword. Herod Agrippa I had his head detached from his body. There was no miraculous intervention for James, as we see later for Peter. Acts chapter 12, as much of Scripture does, presents some difficulties. Why is it that Peter got rescued and James did not? What was it that distinguished these two apostles? Why did God seemingly abandon James and by miraculous intervention by an angel make sure that Peter didn't die? Why would God do such a thing? Luke does not tell us what distinguished the two. I imagine that, I know for sure that when Peter was put in prison, the church gathered together and prayed for him. Luke tells us this. I imagine, do you think that this is reasonable, that when James was put into prison, the church also gathered together to pray for James? And I imagine Peter was a part of that. I imagine Peter joined with the others. Maybe even Peter called for it. Let's gather together at Mary's house and let's pray for James. What did they pray, do you think? One of those times that James and John and Peter were specially selected to be with Jesus, one of those times was at Gethsemane. Now, I know that they had trouble staying awake that night, and even if those three apostles had not fallen asleep, I'm not sure that they were close enough to Jesus to actually hear what Jesus was praying. Take this cup from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. I'm not sure they were close enough to actually hear it, but somehow the Christians found out what Jesus had prayed. Maybe Jesus himself reported it. Maybe they did overhear it, because it's reported in all three synoptic gospels. And I just want to make a suggestion that maybe when the church gathered together to pray for James, and maybe it's the same case when they gathered together to pray for Peter, maybe they were reflecting on Gethsemane. And maybe they also prayed as Jesus had prayed, "Oh God, let this cup pass from our brother James, if it be your will. And if it is not your will, O God, please allow him to glorify you through his death." There are certain people or certain times that people value a particular way of dying. I have not exactly read, but listened to the novel Dracula quite a number of times. I don't know, maybe 10, 15 times. It is fantastic. The novel Dracula. I do not credit the movies. I'm not telling you to go watch Dracula movies. Some people have, when I've talked about this, have misunderstood and they went and watched some and they said that wasn't any good at all. Well, I'm not saying the movies are any good, but I am saying the novel Dracula is fantastic, and I would almost tell you that it is one of the most spiritual novels I have ever read. Good versus evil is on plain display in the novel Dracula. I listen to it. There's this particular reading that every October, can you guess why it's October that I choose to do this? That I will listen to the novel Dracula. It's wonderful. There's this one moment in it where Lucy Westenra, who is this young bride-to-be, is losing a lot of blood for some unknown reason. We've got that Van Helsing is waiting on her. He's there with her. Dr. Seward is there. There are others that are attending to Lucy Westenra, and she keeps losing blood, and they cannot figure out why she is always looking so pale and weak and worn. She can't hardly even get out of bed. They do notice that there are these two little pinprick holes right here in her neck, but what can that possibly mean? You can't lose that amount of blood through those little holes. And there's this one moment, there's this guy named Arthur Holmwood, who is the fiancé of Lucy Westenra. And he sees his beloved looking so pale and weak. And he doesn't know that already Van Helsing has done transfusions of blood from multiple men, the blood of multiple men have already gone into the veins of Lucy, and she keeps losing the blood. And there's this one moment where Arthur Holmwood says to Van Helsing, "If there is anything I can do," he says, "if you only knew how gladly I would die for her." The state hero of Connecticut is this guy named Nathaniel Hale. Now, some of you who are American history buffs, you might recognize the name Nathaniel Hale, and you might be asking yourself, who is the state hero of Kentucky? I do not believe there is a state hero of Kentucky, not an official state hero of Kentucky. Now, I do know from Google that if you go to the Capitol Rotunda in Frankfurt, that there are a few statues in that Capitol Rotunda that are collectively called heroes. I don't remember who all they are, but Abraham Lincoln is one of them. Well, I'll leave it at that. Right. And so there are a few state heroes. I don't think that Kentucky has an official state hero. I have looked for it for Alabama. I don't think there is. In fact, I don't think any state has an official state hero except for Connecticut. So just to ease your mind before you start wondering that trivia. Okay, Connecticut's state hero is this guy named Nathaniel Hale, who died September 22nd, 1776. He was sort of an American spy. This is 1776, right? Revolutionary War. He was an American spy on, a spy for the Americans against the British. He was spying on the British. Colonial spy against the mother country, if you want to put it in those terms. And he knew as he took up this opportunity to spy on the British, he knew that he could face death in doing that, and he did face death. He was caught. And just as he was being hanged, he said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." There are certain times and certain people that value a particular way of dying because of what that death represents. We've got really all kinds of stories about Christians and Jews facing that same opportunity. Think about Fox's Book of Martyrs, which you've probably heard of even if you haven't read. Or think about Hebrews 11:35, which says, "Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection." I don't know exactly what the writer of Hebrews is thinking of there. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. I don't know exactly what he was thinking of, but I have a guess. There is this story in ancient Jewish literature about these 7 brothers, Jewish boys, that face a choice. This king, some of you may have heard of this king, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was a king over Judah in the 2nd century BC, so maybe 200 years before the time of Jesus. And he was trying to force these Jewish boys to abandon the law of Moses. Break the law of Moses, show that you don't believe any of that junk, that you're going to be a good Greek citizen, and I will let you live. Refuse me, and you will face gruesome death. Specifically, he was trying to get them to eat pork, which was the symbol. If you'll do that, I know that the Jewish law does not mean anything to you. And according to the story, one by one, these 7 brothers stood up and made a speech to Antiochus Epiphanes about, sort of like Jesus, you can kill the body, but you cannot kill the soul. And I know that God is going to give me my body back in the resurrection. And you are just some human being, but I fear God. And one by one, they made a similar kind of speech. And they went to their death to prove the courage of their convictions. And last of all, the mama who had been watching each one of her 7 sons die, the mama who had encouraged each one of her 7 sons to go to death rather than abandon the law of God, she herself was put to death and thereby glorified God in their death. I don't know if James, in Acts chapter 12, made a speech. I don't know exactly how he faced his death because Luke does not tell us. It's very bare bones on the details in Acts chapter 12. Just Herod Agrippa got out a sword and chopped off James's head. I wonder how he faced his own death. I'm sure he faced it bravely. Eusebius actually tells us a story. You remember Eusebius is the church historian from about 300 years later. He tells the story of James's death, and he says that James did, in fact, make a speech, very bravely naming the name of Christ before he went to his death. And his speech was so moving that the centurion guarding James had the courage to admit that he himself was also a Christian, and they together went out to face execution. I don't know if that's true. That's the story Eusebius tells. I bet James did remember some special times with Jesus as he was going out to the chopping block. I bet he remembered being on the mountain of transfiguration and seeing Jesus glowing. And I bet he remembered seeing Moses and Elijah, who had been dead for so long, but lo and behold, they're not really dead after all. Here they are, as if death itself is a stage that we pass through to the next existence. I bet he remembered the words of Jesus, "If you would be my disciple, you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me." I bet he remembered that moment that he and his brother had so audaciously come up to Jesus and asked him for the best seats in the kingdom. And I bet he remembered what Jesus had said. "You will drink the cup that I drink." And here he was about to face that cup and drink it down. I bet James remembered those things as he was going to death. And I bet he felt sort of like Arthur Holmwood. If you only knew how gladly I would lay down my life for my Lord. I bet he felt a little bit like Nathaniel Hale. I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my Lord. But it does also make me think, how did Peter feel about all this? To see James die while Peter gets a special visitation from an angel to rescue him. I've never been in the military and I've never seen combat, and so most of what I know about this comes from movies and TV, and I assume that in a few ways at least, that the impression I gain from those sources is reasonably accurate in some ways about what it is like, and specifically this. Especially these days in the 21st century, late 20th century, when you see movies about military people coming back from combat to America, oftentimes what will be represented is the difficulty that they face acclimating to society again. Sometimes that's PTSD. Sometimes it's survivor's guilt. I saw my buddies die. Why didn't I die? In fact, Jody and I recently, this is not just late 20th century, early 21st century, it's gone on for a long time that movies have represented this aspect. Some of y'all may have seen The Best Years of Our Lives. It's this old movie, black and white. I think it came out in the late 40s. It's Frederick March and Myrna Loy, and I can't remember who all, but Teresa Wright is in there. And it's about guys who have come back from World War II. And one of the fellas is a seaman who has hooks for his hands, played by an actor who was in the Navy, who lost his hands, and actually this actor actually did have hooks for his hands. The only role he ever played in the movies, this actor, I can't remember his name, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor for that role, the only role he ever played. And it's about how they have come back. It's not about World War II at all. It's about what it's like for these guys after World War II, getting back in society. And there are moments, especially for one guy whose name I can't remember. There's three main characters. It's not the guy with the hooks. It's not Frederick March. It's the other guy. Dana Andrews is the actor's name. Thank you. And he will wake up in the middle of the night screaming. He has these nightmares. And the nightmares are about his buddies that are dying in the war, and he couldn't save them. I assume that's reasonably accurate. People do experience survivor's guilt In the musical version of Les Miserables, near the end, Marius sings these words, "Oh, my friends, forgive me that I live and you are gone. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on." This is not in Acts 12 at all, but I do wonder, what did Peter think about James dying and Peter not? Did he think, like Marius, forgive me that I live and you are gone? I bet Peter had prayed for James and then saw James killed and Peter miraculously saved. I don't know the answer to any of these questions. I just ask the questions, but it does make me think of these famous words. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. In this context, I'm not so interested about government of the people and by the people and for the people. That is to say, I am certainly interested in that concept, but in a Christian worship service, I quote the words of Abraham Lincoln to help us reflect on the meaning of life and the meaning of death. We have been spared. We're sitting here. We have not died. What do we do with that? It is for us, the living, rather to be here dedicated. James was privileged with the honor of dying on behalf of his master. Peter would also have that privilege later. But first, the task of living. It's reported that George Washington one time said to one of his young lieutenant colonels, dying is easy, young man. Living is harder. Peter faced that same task. Dying is easy. Living is harder. And we are in the same boat with Peter. The task, the responsibility, the burden we have is to live in such a way to glorify our Master. And maybe we will be privileged, as James was, with the honor of dying for him as well. Would you pray with me? Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity we've had to reflect on the story of James and Peter. We pray that you will help us to glorify you in our life and in our death. We thank you for the death of Jesus and his life and his continuing intercession on our behalf. We pray in his name. Amen.